I should have known the moment I saw the envelope. Something about it felt off, too pristine, too formal, as if it had been carefully crafted to manipulate. "We are thrilled to invite you to our annual charity gala," it read, printed on thick, expensive cardstock. Julia and I had attended this event for years, a night of forced smiles, rubbing elbows with the city's wealthiest, and enduring endless speeches about philanthropy. She loved it. Me, not so much. But when I mentioned it to her over dinner this year, she barely looked up from her phone. There was something cold in the way she reacted, detached. "I think you should skip it this year," she said, her voice flat. That was my first sign something wasn't right. Her words felt like a door slamming shut between us. "Why?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though the knot tightening in my stomach betrayed me. "We always go together." She didn't even meet my eyes, her fingers scrolling through whatever had her attention on her phone. "It's more of a business thing for me now. Lucas will be there. We have some matters to discuss." Lucas, that name sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't heard it in years. Lucas had been her business partner, a man she once called manipulative, untrustworthy, and dangerous. Their partnership dissolved after he got involved in a shady financial deal that nearly brought down their company. Julia had spoken about him with disgust for months afterward, swearing she'd cut ties with him forever. Now suddenly he was back, and she was, what, friendly with him again? "Lucas?" I leaned back, crossing my arms, studying her face. "I thought he was out of your life." She hesitated for just a second, barely noticeable, but I caught it. "It's just business," she said, finally setting her phone down. "We need to be civil for the sake of the firm. Don't make a big deal out of it." Civil? My mind raced. This was the man who had nearly ruined her career. Now she was brushing it off as if nothing had happened. My stomach tightened. "What's really going on, Julia?" I pressed, my voice a little sharper than I intended. Her eyes flicked to mine, and for a moment, something flashed in them. Panic? Guilt? I couldn't tell. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the calm, controlled look she always wore when she wanted to shut me out. "Don't make a big deal out of this, Mark," she said again, her voice cold. She stood up abruptly, pushing her chair back from the table. "I'm heading to bed. Long day tomorrow." I watched her walk away, feeling a sinking sensation settle in my chest. For months, something had been off between us. I couldn't put my finger on it. Late nights at the office, hushed phone calls, vague explanations. But now, Lucas was back, and whatever distance had been growing between us felt insurmountable. I sat there long after she left, staring at the untouched dinner in front of me, the feeling of unease gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The days that followed felt like slow torture. Julia and I continued our routine, but something had shifted. An invisible wall stood between us, and I couldn't break through it. Every conversation felt stilted, forced. She seemed distracted, distant, always busy with work or her phone. I'd catch her typing messages late into the night, her face illuminated by the soft glow of her screen. But when I asked who she was talking to, she brushed it off. I didn't want to be that husband, the one who doubts everything, who jumps to conclusions without evidence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her to something, or someone. And then there was Lucas. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Maybe I'd been blind, unwilling to see the signs. Maybe Julia wasn't working late for the reasons she claimed. The thought of her with Lucas, rekindling some relationship, making deals behind my back, tightened the knot in my stomach until I could barely breathe. I wasn't sure what pushed me to do it that night. Maybe it was the frustration of the past few weeks finally bubbling over. Maybe it was the gnawing doubt I couldn't ignore any longer. But I made the decision to follow her. I knew it wasn't right. Spying on my own wife, sneaking behind her back. It felt dirty, underhanded. But I couldn't sit in the dark any longer, wondering what was going on. I needed answers. That night, she left the house around 7 p.m., dressed in an elegant black dress, her hair pinned up in the way she always did for formal events. It was the gala, the one she had told me to skip. I watched her leave, my heart pounding in my chest. I waited until she was down the street before grabbing my jacket and keys. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to lock the door behind me. I kept my distance, following her car as she made her way downtown. The streets were buzzing with traffic and lights, but all I could focus on was the taillights of her car ahead of me. She pulled up to the venue, a massive ballroom in the heart of the city, where the city's elite gathered for their annual gala. I watched from a distance as she stepped out of the car, the picture of grace and elegance as she walked toward the grand entrance, a faint smile on her lips. She didn't even glance around, as if she had nothing to hide. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I didn't know what I was expecting. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts. A text from an unknown number. "Watch her closely tonight." My heart dropped into my stomach. The air in the car suddenly felt too thick, too heavy. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. Who the hell was this? How did they know about Julia? Why were they watching her? I quickly typed back, "Who is this?" No response. Panic started to creep in, crawling up my spine. This wasn't just about my marriage anymore. Someone else was involved, someone who knew something I didn't. And they were watching Julia too. I sat there waiting, my heart racing as people filed in and out of the ballroom. Time dragged on, and I started to think I'd made a mistake. Maybe I was reading too much into things. Maybe this was all in my head. But then I saw her. She was standing near the entrance, talking to him. Lucas. I hadn't seen him in years, but sight of him sent a jolt of anger through me. He hadn't changed much. Still tall, still smug, dressed in an expensive suit like he owned the world. His hand rested casually on Julia's arm as they spoke. His expression far too familiar. I gripped the steering wheel, my pulse pounding in my ears. They looked comfortable together, too comfortable. The way they were standing, the way she was leaning in to speak to him, the way he smiled at her. It all felt wrong. Then they moved. Together they slipped through a side door, away from the main crowd, disappearing into the building. I didn't think. I acted. I got out of the car, my heart racing, and followed them. The side door led into a dimly lit hallway, far from the glitz and glamour of the gala. The sound of laughter and music faded as I made my way down the narrow corridor, keeping a safe distance. My mind raced with every step. Was this an affair? A business deal gone wrong? Why was she lying to me? They stopped outside a private room. Lucas opened the door, and they both disappeared inside. I stood there, frozen, my hand hovering near the doorknob. I didn't know what to do. Every nerve in my body was screaming for me to open the door, to barge in and demand answers. But a part of me, the part still clinging to the hope that I was wrong, kept me rooted in place. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear their conversation. Muffled voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their tones were heated, tense. Then, a loud crash, the sound of glass shattering. I flinched, pulling back from the door. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest I could barely think. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. Just as I was about to push it open, the door flew wide, slamming against the wall. Lucas stumbled out, blood dripping down the side of his face, his eyes unfocused, like he'd been hit hard. Then I caught Julia. She was right behind him, her face pale, her hands shaking, her eyes locked on mine, wide with shock, like she hadn't expected to see me there. For a second, none of us moved. "Mark, it's not what you think," she stammered, taking a step toward me, her voice frantic. But I wasn't sure I believed her. Lucas glared at her, then back at me. "You need to leave now," he said, his voice low and dangerous. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was too stunned, too confused. "Go," Julia snapped, her voice breaking. "We don't have time for this." My phone buzzed again, another text, same unknown numbers. "Get out before it's too late." The moment hung in the air like a knife about to drop. Lucas, blood dripping from his temple, stood unsteadily, his eyes fixed on me. Julia, pale and frantic, grabbed my arm, her fingers trembling. "We need to go, Mark," she whispered harshly, pulling me toward the exit. We didn't speak as we raced to the car. Julia's grip on my arm was tight, almost desperate. As she dragged me down the dimly lit hallway, my mind spun with a million questions. What the hell had just happened? Why was Lucas bleeding? And why had Julia been in that room with him, lying to me this entire time? My heart pounded, adrenaline pushing me forward even though my body screamed to stop, to demand answers. I wasn't sure I was ready for the truth. By the time we got to the car, I was shaking. Julia's hands fumbled with the keys, her breaths coming out fast and shallow. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her paranoia infecting me. I couldn't help but look back, half expecting Lucas to burst out of the building, coming for us, but he didn't. As soon as we were inside the car, I slammed the door shut, my mind still reeling. I turned to her, anger bubbling beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. "Start talking," I demanded, my voice harsh. What the hell just happened back there? Why was Lucas bleeding? Julia didn't answer right away. She started the car, speeding out of the parking lot, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. I could feel her panic radiating off her, but it was the silence that scared me the most. She wasn't even trying to explain herself. "Julia," I shouted, my voice cracking with a mix of fear and anger. "You're going to explain this now." Her breath hitched, and for a moment I thought she might break down in, but instead, she took a deep breath, her eyes locked on the road ahead. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she muttered, almost to herself. "What wasn't supposed to happen? Tell me the truth," I snapped, leaning toward her, desperation creeping into my voice. She glanced at me, her face tight with stress, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. Not just the fear of getting caught, but something deeper, something darker. "Lucas and we've been in contact again, but it's not what you think. This isn't about us, it's about something much bigger, dangerous, and I didn't want you involved." I clenched my fist, trying to keep my voice calm, but the anger was boiling up inside me, threatening to explode. "Bigger than what? What did you do?" "I didn't have a choice," she snapped, her voice breaking. "I took something from Lucas, something that could destroy him. I thought I could use it as leverage to keep us safe. But now..." "Leverage," I repeated, my voice filled with disbelief. "You've been lying to me this whole time, and you've been playing a game with Lucas? What the hell is going on, Julia?" Her lips quivered, but she pressed them shut, clearly trying to hold back tears. "Lucas, he's involved in things you don't understand. Dangerous things. Money laundering, human trafficking, organized crime. It's bigger than you think. I found out about it when we were still partners and I took evidence. I thought if I kept it, he wouldn't come after me, but I underestimated him." "Evidence?" I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "You stole evidence from a criminal organization, and you didn't think to tell me?" "I was trying to protect you," she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "I didn't want you to get dragged into this, but now there's no way out." I sat back, staring at her in disbelief. My mind was spinning with everything she had said, trying to make sense of it all. Money laundering, trafficking, organized crime. And she had known this for how long? Months? Years? "You should have told me," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. The hurt in my chest felt like it was spreading, wrapping around my ribs like a vice. "You should have told me what was happening." She didn't respond. She just kept her eyes on the road, her knuckles still white on the steering wheel. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I thought I could handle it on my own," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I thought if I didn't involve you, you'd be safe. But I'm not safe now, am I?" I said bitterly. "Lucas is coming after both of us." She didn't argue. She just nodded, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The drive home felt endless, the weight of Julia's confession sinking in with every passing minute. I stared out the window, my mind a blur of thoughts and emotions. Julia had been living this secret life, balancing on the edge of a criminal empire. And she hadn't told me a thing. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had trusted for years, was a stranger to me now. Every glance at her felt like looking at someone I didn't recognize. And it twisted something inside me, something I couldn't put into words. As soon as we got home, Julia went upstairs without a word. I watched her go, feeling a mixture of anger and helplessness. I didn't know what to do. Confronting her again wouldn't change anything. The damage was done. I paced the living room, my thoughts racing, replaying the events of the night over and over. The blood on Lucas's face, the shattered glass, the way Julia had panicked when she saw me. Then it hit me. I had to find the evidence. If she wasn't going to tell me everything, I needed to see it for myself. The only way to understand what we were really up against was to find out what she had taken from Lucas. I waited until I heard the soft click of the bedroom door upstairs, then began my search. Julia had always been meticulous with her files, organizing everything into neat stacks, color-coded and labeled. But there was one drawer in her office she always kept locked, the one she never let me go through. It took me longer than I expected to find the key. It was tucked away in the back of her desk drawer, behind old receipts and expired insurance papers. My heart pounded as I unlocked the drawer, half expecting her to come downstairs any second. Inside, I found an envelope. It was plain, unmarked, and tucked beneath a stack of documents. I pulled it out, my hands shaking as I opened it. A USB drive fell into my palm. I stared at it for a long moment, my breath catching in my throat. This was it. This was the evidence she had taken from Lucas, the thing that had dragged us both into this nightmare. But as I stood there, holding the drive, my phone buzzed. Another message, same unknown number. "Don't trust her. She's not telling you everything." My heart raced as I stared at the screen, the words sending a chill down my spine. Whoever this was, they knew too much. About Julia, about Lucas, about everything. And they were watching us. I looked down at the USB drive in my hand, torn between fear and the need for answers. I had to know what was on it. I had to see what Julia had been hiding from me, what Lucas was so desperate to get back. Later that night, I confronted Julia. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I pulled out the USB drive and held it up. "I found this," I said, my voice cold. "What's on it?" Her face went pale, her eyes widening with fear. "Mark, you shouldn't have." "What's on it, Julia?" I cut her off, my voice hardening. "What did you take from Lucas?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I could see her struggling, the weight of the lies she'd told me pressing down on her. Finally, she took a deep breath. "It's evidence," she whispered. "Everything. All of Lucas's operations, the people he works with, the money he's laundering, the crimes he's committed, everything." My stomach twisted. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" "I didn't want you involved," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't want you to get hurt." "Hurt?" I let out a bitter laugh. "I'm already involved, Julia. I'm standing here holding the damn evidence. What happens now?" Before she could answer, my phone rang. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening when I saw the caller ID, unknown number. I hesitated for a second, then answered. "Mark," a familiar voice said, cold and calm. "Lucas." I clenched the phone tighter, my heart racing. "What do you want?" There was a pause on the other end, then Lucas's voice came through, low and menacing. "You're in way over your head. I know Julia told you about the USB drive, but she didn't tell you everything. If you don't give it to me, you're both dead." "What did she take from you?" I demanded, my voice shaking with barely controlled anger. Lucas let out a dark chuckle. "Everything. And now, you're going to give it back, or I'll make sure you regret it." The line went dead. I stood there, my mind spinning, my hands shaking. I turned to Julia, who was staring at me, her face pale and drained of color. "Lucas knows," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't say anything. She just stared at me, the fear in her eyes unmistakable. Section 7. The escape plan and final tensions. "We need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now." Julia nodded, her fear palpable, but I could see the guilt in her eyes. She had dragged me into this mess, and now she was realizing just how far in we were. I shoved the USB drive into my pocket, my mind racing as I grabbed my jacket. We couldn't stay here. Lucas would come for us, and when he did, he wouldn't hesitate. I knew that now. He was dangerous, more dangerous than I had ever imagined. As we sped down the highway, heading for the hotel on the outskirts of town, my mind was racing. I wasn't sure where we were going or what our next move would be, but I knew one thing: we couldn't run forever. "What are we going to do?" Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer right away. I didn't have an answer. Everything felt like it was spiraling out of control, and I wasn't sure how to stop it. "We'll figure something out," I said finally. But even I didn't believe the words. The drive to the motel felt suffocating. The weight of Julia's lies hung between us, thick and oppressive, pressing down on every word left unsaid. Every few miles, I glanced over at her, half expecting her to break the silence, to confess something more, but she just stared straight ahead, her face pale and tense. I was tired of waiting for answers. "When we get there, what's the plan?" I asked, trying to mask the frustration in my voice. Julia glanced at me, her expression unreadable. I don't know. I've been trying to contact David, but..." "David?" I interrupted. "Who is David? And why haven't you mentioned him until now?" "He's a former contact. He used to work with Lucas but flipped. He's been helping people expose operations like Lucas's for years. He has connections, people who could protect us." Her voice trembled slightly, as though she wasn't entirely sure David could pull through for us. "So why didn't you go to him sooner?" I shot back, anger bubbling up again. She winced, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the steering wheel. Because Lucas found out I'd been talking to him. David's been in hiding ever since. But if we can reach him, if we can get him the evidence, we might still have a chance." I didn't know if I could believe her anymore. Every new piece of information felt like a patchwork of half-truths and lies, sewn together just well enough to keep me moving, but I had nothing else to cling to. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice tight. "He's not far, about an hour out, in a safe house he uses. I sent him a message earlier. He's expecting us." An hour. It didn't sound far, but it felt like a lifetime away with Lucas breathing down our necks. My phone buzzed again, another text from the unknown number. "David's dead. Lucas got to him first. Don't go." I stared at the message, my heart pounding in my chest. The air seemed to thin, as if the walls of the car were closing in on me. "What is it?" Julia asked, her voice barely concealing her fear. I hesitated, then showed her the message. She paled, shaking her head. That's not possible. David's careful. There's no way Lucas could have found him so quickly. Are you sure? I pressed. Because someone else is following us, Julia. Someone who seems to know exactly what's going on. I don't know who that is, she snapped, her voice cracking with desperation. I swear, Mark, I have no idea. But the doubt was already planted. My mind raced, trying to untangle the web we were caught in. Was David really still alive? Or had this entire escape plan been doomed from the start? I clenched my fists, trying to calm the storm of thoughts swirling inside me. If David was dead, if this was all a trap, then we were driving straight into it. The drive to the safe house felt like an eternity. Every mile we put between us and the city only amplified the tension building inside the car. My phone stayed silent, the unknown messenger offering no more cryptic warnings. But the silence was worse. When we finally arrived, the place looked like something out of a ghost story. An old rundown farmhouse hidden deep in the woods, with overgrown grass swallowing the gravel driveway. The windows were dark, no sign of life inside. This is it, Julia whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. I parked the car, my hands trembling on the wheel. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave before we walked into whatever trap had been set for us. But we didn't have a choice. If there was a chance David could help us, we had to take it. Stay close, I muttered, stepping out of the car. Julia followed me, her movements stiff with fear. We approached the house cautiously, every crunch of gravel beneath our feet sounding too loud in the oppressive quiet. My heart pounded in my ears as we reached the front door, and I raised my hand to knock. But before I could, the door swung open. A man stood in the doorway, tall and thin, his face gaunt but sharp. His eyes flicked between us, sizing us up. Julia? His voice was low, cautious. She nodded, relief flooding her features. David, but something felt wrong. His expression wasn't one of relief. It was cold, calculating. I tensed, every muscle in my body screaming to get out of there. We need to talk, David said, stepping aside to let us in. Julia moved forward, but I hesitated, glancing around the darkened room. The whole situation felt off. Just as I was about to follow her inside, a sharp voice cut through the quiet. I wouldn't do that if I were you. I spun around, heart racing. Two men stood at the edge of the driveway, both armed, their guns trained on us. Julia froze, her breath catching in her throat. Lucas stepped out from behind them, his expression calm, almost amused. I told you, Mark. You should have just given me the drive. My stomach dropped. We were trapped. I glanced at Julia, her face drained of color, her eyes wide with fear. You didn't think I'd let you just walk away, did you? Lucas's voice was cold, calculating. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on mine. Now let's make this easy. Hand over the drive and maybe I'll let you live. Julia's breath hitched beside me, her hands trembling. I could feel the fear radiating off her, but I wasn't sure if it was fear for her life or fear of what was about to happen. I clenched my fists, feeling the USB drive in my pocket. I could give it to him, end this nightmare. But something inside me resisted, a voice whispering that it wasn't over, that this was all part of the game, and giving him the drive wouldn't stop it. What guarantee do we have that you won't kill us? I demanded, my voice shaking with barely contained anger. Lucas chuckled darkly, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Guarantee? You're in no position to make demands, Mark. Hand over the drive or I'll shoot you both right here. I glanced at Julia, searching her face for answers. She looked back at me, her eyes pleading. Mark, please, just give it to him. But I couldn't. Not yet. I pulled the USB drive out of my pocket, holding it up. Lucas's eyes locked onto it like a predator eyeing its prey. He took a step forward, his men closing in behind him, ready to pounce. But before I handed it over, I hesitated. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my gut, that gnawing sense of doubt that had been growing ever since we'd left the house. Lucas was too calm, too confident. He wasn't worried about what was on that drive, because he knew something I didn't. Then it hit me. The unknown messages, the warnings to stay away, the truth I'd been ignoring all along. I turned to Julia, my voice cold. How long have you been working with him? Her eyes widened, her face paling. What? No, Mark, Don't lie to me, I growled, cutting her off. You've been lying this whole time, haven't you? You weren't running from Lucas, you were helping him. No, she cried, her voice breaking. That's not true, I would never. Enough, Lucas snapped, his patience wearing thin. This isn't a soap opera, Mark. Hand over the drive or I'll end this now. But I couldn't hand it over, not without knowing the full truth. I'm not giving you the drive until she tells me the truth, I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. Lucas smirked, glancing at Julia. Go on then, tell him. Julia's face crumpled, her tears finally breaking free. I didn't have a choice, Mark. Lucas, he threatened me. He said he'd kill you if I didn't help him. I stared at her, my heart sinking. So you've been playing both sides this entire time? You knew everything, and you let me walk into this? I was trying to protect you, she sobbed, her voice raw with emotion. I didn't want you to get hurt, but you still lied to me, I said quietly, the betrayal cutting deeper than I thought possible. Enough of this, Lucas barked, stepping forward. Give me the drive, or I'll kill her right here. I took a deep breath, gripping the USB drive. Without warning, I hurled it into the overgrown grass, watching as it disappeared into the dark. Lucas's calm facade shattered as his eyes flared with anger. You think that's going to save you? His voice trembled with rage, his hand already moving toward his gun. My heart seized. Lucas wasn't playing anymore, but just as his finger touched the trigger, a sharp crack split the air. Lucas's hand jerked back, the gun flying out of his grip. He let out a howl of pain, clutching his bleeding hand. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. A figure stepped out of the shadows, gun raised. It was David. David? Julia's voice cracked in disbelief. You're alive? David moved forward, calm but deadly. His gun stayed trained on Lucas, who was hunched over, clutching his bleeding hand. Not for lack of trying, Julia, David said coldly, but I'm alive. Lucas glared at David, hatred flashing in his eyes. You should have stayed dead. David's lips curled into a smirk. You're not the only one who knows how to survive. The two men Lucas had brought with him tensed, their hands inching toward their guns. Don't even think about it, David warned, his aim unwavering. One wrong move, and this ends badly for you. They froze, exchanging nervous glances, clearly uncertain about whether to follow Lucas's orders or save themselves. David moved in closer, his voice cold. Drop the weapons. For a tense moment, neither of Lucas's men moved, but after a glance at their bleeding boss, they slowly lowered their guns to the ground. Lucas's face twisted with fury as he glared up at me. This isn't over, Mark. You think you can outplay me? His voice turned venomous. You're as good as dead. You both are. David stepped in front of me, his voice steady but filled with steel. The only one who's finished here is you, Lucas. David turned toward Julia, his expression hard. Tell him everything. Julia stiffened, her face drained of color. David, please. No more lies, David snapped. He deserves the truth. I turned to Julia, my stomach knotting with dread. What haven't you told me? She hesitated, her hands trembling. Her eyes darted between me and David, searching for an escape. But there wasn't one. Slowly she began to speak, her voice trembling with guilt. Mark, I didn't just steal evidence from Lucas. I made a deal with him before I knew how dangerous he really was. Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. I thought, if I helped him with some deals, I could fix things, save the company, but it got out of control. I didn't know how deep it went. I stared at her, shock and betrayal crashing over me like a wave. You worked with him. Julia's face crumpled. I thought I could pull away, but by the time I realized what he was really doing, trafficking, extortion, it was too late. I took the evidence to protect us, but Lucas found out. He threatened to kill me if I didn't cooperate. My hands clenched into fists. The woman I had trusted with my life had not only kept me in the dark, but had helped the very man trying to destroy us. David's voice was calm but filled with a steely edge. She was playing both sides, Mark, trying to keep Lucas happy while plotting her escape. And now what? I said, barely able to contain my anger. We're both targets because of you, Julia sobbed. I know, Mark, I know, but I didn't know what else to do. I was trapped. I stood there, my mind reeling. I wanted to scream at her, to lash out for everything she had done, but I couldn't. The reality was clear. We were out of time. David broke the silence. We need to leave now. This isn't over. Lucas has more men, and they'll be here soon. David took control. He grabbed one of Lucas's men by the collar, yanking him toward the car. You're driving. Get us out of here, quietly. The man nodded quickly, too scared to resist. David shoved him toward the driver's seat, then motioned for me and Julia to get in the back. I climbed into the car, feeling numb, the weight of Julia's confession pressing down on me like a lead weight. She sat beside me, her shoulders slumped, broken by her guilt. I couldn't look at her. I wasn't sure I could ever look at her the same way again. David slid into the passenger seat, his gun still trained on Lucas's man. Drive, he ordered, his voice cold and steady. As the car sped away from the safe house, Lucas's words echoed in my mind. You'll never get away. You'll never be free of me. The ride was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional bump in the road. I stared out the window, the passing trees blurring together as my mind raced. The anger and betrayal swirled inside me like a storm, threatening to break free. Finally, I couldn't hold it in anymore. How long were you planning to lie to me, Julia? My voice was low but filled with barely controlled rage. She didn't look at me. I never wanted to lie, Mark. I was trying to protect you. Protect me? I spat, the words bitter. You worked with him. You lied to me. You put both our lives at risk. How the hell is that protecting me? Her shoulders shook as she sobbed quietly. I thought I could fix it. I thought if I kept you out of it, you'd be safe. I didn't realize how deep it went until it was too late. You should have told me, I said, my voice shaking. You should have let me help you before this got so far. She turned to me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. I didn't want to lose you, Mark. I thought I could fix it on my own, but I failed. I didn't know what to say. Every part of me was torn between the love I still had for her and the anger that her betrayal had unleashed. I looked away, unable to face her. We pulled into a dingy motel on the outskirts of the city, the sun beginning to rise over the horizon. The car rolled to a stop, and David turned to me, his face grim. You need to disappear, he said. Lucas has more men. This isn't over. I nodded, feeling the full weight of what that meant. Disappearing meant leaving everything behind. Our home, our life, everything we'd built. But it wasn't really a choice, was it? We were being hunted. David handed me a small burner phone. I'll be in touch. Keep this on you, but don't use it unless you have no other option. He glanced at Julia, then back at me. You'll have to figure out what to do next, but you can't trust anyone. Not anymore. As David drove off, leaving us standing in the motel parking lot, I turned to Julia. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, her body trembling with guilt and fear. Mark, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. I stared at her, my emotions a tangled mess inside me. I wanted to forgive her, to hold her and tell her we'd find a way out of this, but I wasn't sure I could ever trust her again. I don't know if we can ever come back from this, I said quietly. You've destroyed everything. Her face crumpled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I know, but I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure there was a way to make this right. We walked into the motel in silence, two people trapped in a nightmare of their own making, unsure of what the future held. For now, all I knew was that we were running from Lucas, from the wreckage of our lives, and maybe from each other.